Thank you, esteemed Chairperson. At the outset, let me quickly thank Dr. Panda, the echelon authorities at IDSA and Japan Foundation for inviting me. As I understand, I'm the only outstation national delegate out here at this particular conclave today. So thank you very much. I'm going to be talking about Sagar and what is this whole construct all about, and where do we see India-Japan cooperation in terms of that particular construct. Now, it's quite clear that when you look at some of the important connectivity constructs which have been emerging over the last decade or so, it's a little interesting to see how Sagar seems to be operating. If you talk to international audiences abroad, they're quite most of the time perplexed by this term Sagar. It hasn't quite caught the imagination, the global imagination, and it takes some time recall before they can actually kind of contextualize this particular statement which the Prime Minister Modi made in 2015. This is quite different from the BRI, which has had a lot of intellectual heavy lifting, and of course the pivot to Asia, which also had its own kind of intellectual heavy lifting. So in that sense, Sagar operates from a position of a detriment in terms of catching the public imagination, both of the strategic community and of the political community worldwide. Security and growth for all in the region is the formulation of Sagar. To anybody looking at it, he would think that this is like motherhood and apple pie, because security and growth are considerations for any country irrespective of the tier of their economic profile. So what is so interesting about this? But when you look at the whole idea from India's perspective, you realize that there are some very, very interesting overplays and underpinnings to this particular contrast. The first thing is that when India looks at Sagar, it looks at Sagar in terms of an in-out strategy. When India looks at the ability to build this particular concept, it looks at this concept essentially from the point of view of building its own national power first. And its national power, once built, can then be effectively leveraged or postured in the underbelly, its maritime underbelly, to be able to achieve its national interest. I think this is in stark contrast to other connectivity enterprises. For example, the BRI, which actually is not an in-out strategy. It's actually a strategy where China is trying to go outbound to be able to take care of some of the infirmities of stagnation that are developing within its own country. The same is with the pivot to Asia. It's not an in-out strategy. It's really an outbound strategy by the Americans, who realize they have to be engaged with the region, otherwise the receding of the space will cost them very, very badly. So in that sense, Sagar is a different concept. Sagar emerges in the context of three very important trends that are coming to light. The first is the buccaneering presence of China and its strategic accent in India's maritime underbelly. The second is the re-engaging of America, yet the reticence of America also leaves us a little bit holding the weak end of the wedge. And the third is national rejuvenation of certain powers. And here I think both India and Japan are both in this category. However, both are rejuvenating differently. In the case of India, our national rejuvenation is in terms of building national capacity across the country and being able to leverage it. In the case of Japan, they already have captive potential which they want to leverage abroad much beyond their immediate neighborhood. So their national rejuvenation or the normalization of Japan is in a different template than the rejuvenation of India, but at the end of the day, both are trying to rejuvenate themselves. Looking at Sagar, nothing emerges in an abstraction. So what has been the contextual background to Sagar, and from there we'll see how the India-Japan cooperation takes over. There have been some important timelines over the last 10-15 years that one can look at in terms of how India has operated within its maritime space. It actually goes back to the time when China began to ring-fence India in the early 2000s. And India's approach to this potential cordon sanitaire was really to almost accept a fait accompli that the world is large enough for India and China to operate together. And this was construed by Beijing as basically a kind of a tacit acceptance by India that they would accept some degree of insubordination within the maritime neighborhood. Secondly, we see that when non-conventional threats began to emerge around 2006-07, basically the piracy issue, despite the Indian Navy pushing the political establishment for a tougher line, the political establishment was quite timorous. And I think this timorousness actually cost India, because we lost a lot of credibility in our neighborhood that India probably was not up to the mark in terms of meeting some of these security obligations in its neighborhood. The third is really the inability to be able to leverage effectively your cutting edge platforms. I don't think it's anyone's case that the Indian Navy is not a blue water Navy. But then when you have certain platforms that are emerging, you also have to be able to articulate your power projection in the context of those particular platforms. The Indian government also has quite been lacking in the past over this. The fourth really is the forerunner, which we call as Project Mawsum. Now, Project Mawsum, for all that it did, no one is surprised that it turned out to be quite anodyne, because it lacked the conceptual clarity, it lacked the political will, and in the end, it tried to believe that soft power by itself can actually supplant hard power. No matter what the allure for soft power may be, the soft power has to be based on the plinth of hard power. And so that was the problem out there. If you look at a number of different components that are today part of Sagar, they actually ironically emerged during the premiership of Prime Minister Vajpayee. Whether it's Sagarmala, which is the port development project, or Chabahar, they all developed then, and for some strange reason, they almost seemed to be fledgling till they were picked up and put into a composite whole of what is today called as Sagar by Prime Minister Modi. So one has to look at that as well. The Look East engagement of India, for all the refreshingness of the approach, in a sense got itself caught up with some of the richer Southeast Asian countries and got caught up only in trade flows, as a result of which the strategic intertwining of Southeast Asia and South Asia is something that also fell behind. Our leadership of IORA, the fact that even when we had the chairmanship of IORA, we couldn't do much with running with it, I think also showed our inability to be able to craft an Indian Ocean community. And also the same thing applies to floundering regionalism within South Asia. So in this context, where do we see Japan and India moving on this whole Sagar concept? The first thing is, what Japan brings to the table is that they're able to offer solutions for India's domestic infrastructure. I think India's infrastructure story is a very interesting tale. We have chunks of good infrastructure in our country, but we've not been able to build the infrastructure ecosystem. And which is why most of our infrastructure is like a standalone locale rather than actually being an ecosystem. I think Japan comes in there with its industrial capacity and its technical capacity to be able to deliver on that particular aspect. The second is, there are new frontiers of development. We are all seeing, for example, how your islands can become your new coastal frontiers, how tourism can actually become a very, very important example. And the best example is China. I'll not go into details on it, but everyone knows how it's important. So in the development of India's islands, Japan becomes a very, very important player, because most of our islands don't just need military infrastructure, but what they actually need is good quality civilian infrastructure to be able to empower the coastal management systems. The third is what was mentioned in the morning about actually being able to provide solutions at both ends of the spectrum. We need solutions for low-end value chain, and we also need solutions for the high-end value chain. For instance, India and Japan can do a lot more in the poorer countries in terms of unlocking the captive strength than it can do in terms of putting physical infrastructure and trying to compete with China. The next aspect is the fact that basically when it comes to India, India's infrastructure either grows linearly or it grows into a quantum leap. The best example is in terms of the digital divide. If you want to take care of the digital divide, then Chinese technology comes in very handy to be able to make that quantum leap. Even as Chinese technology or Japanese technology also can actually help you build incrementally in a linear fashion to move your country up the value chain. So in terms of all this, the fact remains that India and Japan can actually work across a very, very large canvas of cooperation, but that cooperation essentially is investment based, because we live in an era where trade protectionism is taking over in a very, very big way, where all countries are more interested in bilateralism than they are in multilateralism, and that's where India and Japan can offer a qualitative paradigm to the existing project normative considerations that China has. However, the main point will be that the proof of the pudding is always going to be in the eating. And while Japan and India have qualitatively good principles on which they have based their normative concurrence, if they are not able to translate that into projects on the ground in countries that are part of the growth corridor, then what will happen is the Chinese project-based normatism will be the only driving force and will make it very difficult to contain China in our sphere of influence. Thank you very much.
Thank you.